Go to Mr. Natsios for a question about emergency aid to Syria that might make my point and your point here. The majority of food aid we've been discussing is through the Department of Agriculture's Food for Peace. Now, there is a small, separate emergency food security program that USAID set up, all right? This emergency program allows for cash resources to be used for local and regional purchases of food and food vouchers. And as I understand it, if not for the flexibility of that program, USAID would not have been able to launch a rapid food response to the Syrian crisis, and here's why. Because it's a very stark contrast. The first shipment, U.S. food shipment, just arrived in the region in Syria. Just arrived 2 weeks ago. That's 2 years after the crisis began. But even with this shipment, it is now the case that trucking it in to the population in need, because of the difficulties of doing that, it's not conceivable to move major portions of food by truck into those regions on a daily basis because there's a daily assault by the Syrian military units. So that isn't likely to happen. So this old structure, you know, frankly, comes 2 years late, and now the food aid is in country, but how do you get it to the region most in need, to those most in need? So with a more flexible program, it seems to me, we've been able to respond quickly, we've been able to maintain access and help keep local markets running and reduce the probability of aid dependency over the long term. But I'd like to just ask you for your thoughts on that, Mr. Natsios.
Well, this goes back, Mr. Chairman, to this comment of Amartya Sen that when you have a 7,000-mile supply chain, a lot of things can happen along the way. It's not just in the country. We had pirates in Somalia steal or take 2 ships. They pirated 2 ships of food aid from the World Food Program over a number of years, and we never saw another shipment of food sank in a storm. The warehouses down in Galveston, we were crossing our fingers when the Hurricane Katrina, it barely missed those warehouses. We would have had people die because those warehouses had been destroyed. They weren't, but it was very close. So the longer the supply chain, the more bad things can happen. But particularly, the most serious problem we face is in civil wars where there's food insecurity. And most of the food now, 82% of all food from Food for Peace is now going to emergencies, which is usually civil wars and famines. Most famines are also an offshoot of civil wars. The two things are a toxic mix with each other. And what usually happens is one side sees the food coming in because it's very visible. You can't hide 100,000 tons of food. You can't ship it electronically through a banking system, which you can do with cash, to an NGO doing local vouchers, for example. It's a giant red flag. And if a particular side in a civil war wants to starve their opponents to death, the way you do is you blow up the food shipments. And this is not new. The Sudanese government starved hundreds of thousands of Southerners to death during the Sudanese Civil War, which killed 4 million people over 50 years. There were 2 civil wars, actually. And a lot of those people died of starvation because the government used a very long supply chain, the logistical system to get food in, to simply stop the shipments. Mengistu did the same thing, the Marxist dictator of Ethiopia, in 1990 and 91, and he was blowing up our shipments of food convoys going into Ethiopia because he was trying to starve the Tigrayans and the Eritreans to death during a famine. And the way we, in fact, got around that is I, with congressional approval, used a couple of $1 million in the OFDA budget, which is a separate emergency account. It's not supposed to be used for food purchase. Not by law. By law we could do it, but the Congress said that's for health and water and sanitation and shelter. The Food for Peace budget's for food. But in this particular case, they let us do it. We bought 20,000 tons of sorghum in a surplus area that Mengistu did not control. We moved it into the famine area. We saved tens of thousands of people's lives by doing that. That's where I got convinced in that 1990 famine that this is the best way to approach this. And you, Mr. Chairman, have just pointed out not a 20-year-old example, but a current example of exactly the same thing happening in Syria.
And I think now we need to go to the cargo preference, the impact on competition there. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, because USAID reports that on average only 2 to 4 companies respond to solicitations to ship food aid to begin with. How does the lack of competition among shippers impact cost, and how does it impact accountability? I'm going to ask you those questions, and then I'd also, during your tenure at USAID, we began to become involved in a number of major conflicts. So I'm going to ask you that if during your tenures, were any private U.S.-flagged commercial vessels called upon to protect U.S. maritime security during that period of time? And to your knowledge, since the Cargo Preference Act was enacted back in 1954, have any private U.S.-flagged commercial vessels ever been called upon to protect U.S. maritime security? And I'll just finish with this last question. Should U.S.-flagged vessels that fail to meet the eligibility criterion for the Maritime Security Program continue to be eligible for cargo preference?
Well, I don't want to start casting aspersions on different industries, Mr. Chairman, but I am not a supporter of the cargo preference law, particularly with respect to AID. It's outlived its usefulness. The argument during the Cold War was that we needed our merchant marine because there was an existential threat to the survival of the United States during World War II and then during the Cold War. And it was real. And we needed to protect our domination of the world sea lanes. That is no longer the case. The threats to the United States are not of the same character. We're not facing a superpower that's threatening whole regions of the world. The threat now is completely different. Al-Qaeda is not threatening the sea lanes of the world. They're threatening terrorist acts in particular countries, but they're not the same kind of threat. And so the general justification for the cargo preference law, in my view, doesn't exist anymore. And I think your questions answer themselves, Mr. Chairman. There's no justification for doing this, particularly when there's been such a huge decline in the amount of tonnage we've been able to buy, because there's been a big increase in food prices. And there's an argument from some reputable economists that we're not going to go back to the era of cheap food anymore. There's been a huge decline in the volume of food aid we've been able to deliver. And the principal source of most food aid in the international system is the U.S. government. It's not other countries. We are the greatest agricultural power in the world. I mean, our farmers are the best in the world and the most efficient and highest quality. But the reality is prices are going up, and so we're able to buy less food. We need the reforms now in order to buy more food with a fixed budget, given the fiscal constraints the federal government is facing.
Thank you, Mr. Nacios. We'll go to Mr. Engel.